If she walks out that gate tonight, never let her return." The cold words echoed through the marble corridor long after the royal council had fallen silent, but the young Omega standing outside the half-open door never shed a single tear. Evelyn Carter lowered her eyes, pressed trembling fingers against the simple silver pendant resting over her heart, and quietly accepted that there was no place left for her inside the Alpha King's court. The palace that had once felt like a sanctuary had slowly become a place where every whisper carried doubt and every smile concealed judgment. No one stopped her as she crossed the grand hallway lined with towering windows glowing beneath the last golden light of evening. Servants hurried past without looking up. Noble guests continued their conversations as though nothing important had happened. To everyone else, she was only another quiet Omega whose presence had never truly mattered. High above the courtyard, King Nathaniel Ashford stood beside the balcony overlooking the kingdom that stretched far beyond the castle walls. Tall, commanding, and respected by every alpha in the realm, he never turned to see the woman walking away from everything she had known. His advisors had assured him she would return before dawn. They always did, they claimed. Comfort, security, and royal protection were impossible to abandon forever. Nathaniel accepted those words without question. "She will come back," he said calmly before leaving the balcony, convinced the matter required no further thought. Beneath the fading sky, Evelyn reached the massive iron gates separating the palace from the winding road beyond. She paused for only a single heartbeat. Behind her rose the magnificent towers where she had spent years believing loyalty would eventually earn acceptance. Ahead waited uncertainty, silence, and a future she could not yet imagine. Slowly, she removed the small palace key that had hung from her belt since the day she first entered the court. She placed it carefully on the weathered stone beside the gate, the only thing she intended to leave behind. Without another glance toward the castle, she stepped onto the empty road and disappeared into the gathering twilight. Inside the palace, evening celebrations continued beneath glittering chandeliers. Music drifted through elegant halls while crystal glasses touched in cheerful celebration. No one noticed that one chair remained empty. No one asked where the gentle Omega had gone. Not even the king. Hours passed. Midnight settled over the kingdom. A cold breeze swept through the quiet corridor outside Evelyn's chamber, gently pushing her door open. The room remained perfectly ordered. Her books rested neatly upon the shelf. Fresh flowers still stood beside the window. Every trace of her kindness remained exactly where she had left it, except for one small object resting alone at the center of the wooden table. It was not a letter. It was not jewelry. It was a faded blue ribbon, carefully folded, tied around a tiny carved wooden wolf that Nathaniel himself had given her years earlier after promising she would always have a place within his court. Before sunrise, an elderly housekeeper entered the silent room, stared at the forgotten keepsake, and quietly whispered words that no one else was there to hear. "She is not coming back this time." 5 years passed so quietly that even the oldest servants in Blackwood Palace stopped speaking Evelyn Carter's name aloud. Seasons painted the kingdom in endless cycles of snow, blossoms, golden harvests, and winter frost, yet the empty place she had left behind remained strangely untouched. The faded blue ribbon wrapped around the tiny carved wooden wolf still rested inside a small drawer in the former Omega chamber because the elderly housekeeper could never bring herself to throw it away. King Nathaniel Ashford rarely entered that wing of the palace anymore. His kingdom prospered. Trade expanded across neighboring territories. Noble families continued urging him to choose a Luna worthy of the throne, but every proposal ended the same way. Nathaniel politely declined without offering an explanation that even he could fully understand. The confidence that had once allowed him to say, "She will come back," had long since faded into a quiet habit of never mentioning the woman who had disappeared beyond the palace gates. Outside the royal walls, life moved on with equal determination. New villages grew beside old roads. Children who had once been carried in their mother's arms were now old enough to work in family shops and fields. Travelers told countless stories gathered from distant towns, yet none ever reached the palace carrying news of Evelyn Carter. It was almost as though the earth itself had hidden her from the world she chose to leave behind. Then, on an unusually cool autumn morning, a covered carriage stopped before the servants' entrance of Blackwood Palace. A small group of newly hired workers climbed down one after another, each carrying little more than a travel bag and letters of recommendation. Among them walked a quiet young woman, wearing a simple gray servant's dress beneath a plain wool cloak. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest scarf, and years of patient living had softened the youthful innocence once visible in her face into calm confidence. She kept her eyes lowered as the head steward checked each name against the employment register. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Emily Carter," she answered gently. The steward nodded, marked the page, and motioned her inside. No one questioned the familiar surname. No one looked closely enough to recognize the woman who had once crossed the same courtyard carrying flowers for the royal library and warm bread for elderly servants. The palace had changed, and so had she. Her movements were steady. Her voice remained soft, but no longer uncertain. She expected nothing from the magnificent halls surrounding her. She came neither seeking forgiveness nor longing to reclaim what had been lost. She had accepted temporary work simply because winter approached, and the palace always needed additional staff before the annual royal gathering. As she quietly followed the other servants through polished stone corridors, countless memories drifted silently through her mind, yet none slowed her footsteps. Somewhere beyond those towering walls, King Nathaniel Ashford continued his morning schedule, completely unaware that the woman he had believed gone forever had already returned beneath the same roof. Fate had brought them together once again, but this time she entered the palace through a servant's door carrying no expectations, no resentment, and no intention of allowing the past to decide who she had become. The first time King Nathaniel Ashford saw the new maid, he did not even realize he had stopped walking. Morning sunlight poured through the towering stained glass windows of the eastern corridor, casting ribbons of gold and sapphire across the polished marble floor as servants moved quietly between their daily duties. Nathaniel had just concluded a meeting with his advisors and was already thinking about trade agreements waiting on his desk when a soft voice drifted through the hallway. "Excuse me. Allow me." The words were simple, spoken with calm courtesy as the young maid stepped aside to let an elderly servant pass with a heavy basket of fresh linens. Nathaniel continued forward without looking directly at her. Yet something about the gentle rhythm of that voice tugged unexpectedly at a memory buried so deeply that he almost dismissed it as imagination. A few steps later he paused. He slowly turned his head, searching the corridor behind him. The young woman remained focused on arranging folded blankets onto a wooden cart. Her posture was graceful but unremarkable, exactly as any diligent servant should appear. Her blonde hair was neatly tucked beneath a plain scarf, and nothing about her clothing suggested she had ever belonged anywhere except the servants' quarters. She never once looked toward the king. Nathaniel frowned slightly before continuing on his way, telling himself that 5 years had changed far more than voices. Yet the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. Throughout the day, he caught brief glimpses of the unfamiliar maid in different corners of the palace. She carried fresh flowers into the royal library. She helped an aging cook lift heavy pots in the kitchen. She paused to comfort a frightened stable boy after one of the horses became restless, speaking with the same quiet patience that somehow sounded painfully familiar. Every encounter lasted only seconds, but each left Nathaniel with the strange certainty that he had witnessed these ordinary gestures before. Late that afternoon, he entered the palace gardens hoping the crisp autumn air would clear his thoughts. As he walked beneath rows of ancient oak trees, he noticed the same maid kneeling beside a flower bed, carefully tying a broken stem upright with a narrow strip of cloth instead of removing it. The royal gardener watched with curiosity. "Most people would simply replace it," the old man remarked. The young woman smiled softly without lifting her eyes. "Sometimes all something needs is a little time and gentle care." Nathaniel froze where he stood. Those exact words had been spoken years ago when a wounded songbird had fallen into the palace courtyard during a spring storm. He remembered dismissing the tiny creature as beyond saving, but Evelyn had carefully wrapped its injured wing before releasing it weeks later beneath the same open sky. The memory struck him with such unexpected force that he could almost hear her laughter carried by the breeze. Before he realized what he was doing, Nathaniel took a step closer. The young maid sensed someone approaching and slowly rose to her feet. For the first time, their eyes met across the quiet garden path. She bowed respectfully, her expression peaceful and unreadable. "Good afternoon, Your Majesty," she said with perfect composure. Nathaniel stared silently at her face, feeling the impossible beginning to take shape inside his heart, while she lowered her gaze once more as though they were nothing more than strangers meeting for the very first time. King Nathaniel Ashford did not sleep well that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the calm face of the new maid and heard the quiet confidence in her voice. It was impossible, he reminded himself again and again. 5 years had passed. Evelyn Carter had vanished without leaving a single clue about where she intended to go. If she were alive, she would have built a completely different life far away from Blackwood Palace. That was the only explanation that made sense. Yet the memory of the garden lingered like a melody that refused to fade. Before sunrise the next morning, Nathaniel abandoned his usual routine and walked through the palace without announcing his presence. Instead of entering the council chamber, he wandered through servant corridors, kitchens, libraries, and storage rooms, telling himself he merely wished to observe how the palace functioned before the coming winter. No one questioned the king's unusual inspection. As he quietly passed each room, he noticed the same young maid carrying out ordinary tasks with remarkable patience. She greeted every servant with equal respect regardless of rank. She carefully polished antique picture frames without rushing. She noticed a loose stone beneath an elderly maid's foot and gently guided her around it before she could stumble. None of these actions were extraordinary by themselves, but together they awakened memories Nathaniel had spent years trying to bury beneath responsibility. He remembered another young woman who had quietly repaired torn books instead of replacing them, who had always carried extra bread for hungry stable boys, who believed kindness was strongest when nobody noticed it. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel paused outside the royal library after hearing soft laughter inside. Through the slightly open door, he watched the new maid helping a nervous young page organize shelves filled with dusty historical records. The boy accidentally dropped an entire stack of heavy books across the wooden floor. His face turned pale with embarrassment. Before he could apologize, the maid simply knelt beside him with a warm smile. "Everyone drops something while learning," she said gently. "The important part is that you pick it up with patience instead of fear." Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. Those words were different, yet they carried the same quiet wisdom Evelyn had once shared with frightened children visiting the palace school. He remained hidden until the room fell silent, then stepped away before either of them noticed him. That evening, he summoned Eleanor Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper who had served the royal family longer than anyone else in the palace. "Tell me about the new maid," he said as calmly as possible. Eleanor thought for a moment before answering. "She works harder than anyone I have hired in years, Your Majesty. She never complains. She asks for nothing. The younger servants already trust her because she always helps before being asked." Nathaniel looked toward the window where autumn rain had begun tapping softly against the glass. "Has she spoken much about her past?" Eleanor slowly shook her head. "No, Your Majesty. She smiles politely whenever someone asks, but she gently changes the subject. It is almost as though she has already made peace with whatever she left behind." Nathaniel said nothing after that. As Eleanor quietly left the room, his eyes settled on the rain beyond the castle walls. For the first time in 5 years, certainty abandoned him completely. Deep inside, a question he had tried to ignore was becoming impossible to silence. If the woman serving inside his palace truly was Evelyn Carter, then why had she returned only to live each day as though he had never been part of her life at all? The question followed King Nathaniel Ashford through every hour of the following week until it became impossible to ignore. Rather than demanding answers, he quietly watched from a distance, discovering pieces of the woman called Emily Carter that no report from his advisors could ever explain. She was always the first servant awake, lighting lanterns before sunrise so the elderly staff would not have to climb dark staircases alone. She somehow remembered everyone's favorite tea without writing a single note. When a frightened kitchen apprentice accidentally burned an entire batch of fresh bread, she calmly showed him how to prepare another before the morning meal, accepting none of the praise after the problem had been solved. The palace staff slowly began relying on her without realizing it. She never asked to be noticed, yet people naturally sought her whenever they needed patience instead of judgment. Nathaniel found himself standing silently outside open doorways, observing moments that lasted only a few seconds but remained with him long afterward. One afternoon, he watched Emily remove her own warm shawl and gently place it around the shoulders of an elderly gardener who insisted he was not cold despite the sharp autumn wind. She smiled, returned to trimming flower beds in the chilly air, and never mentioned the gesture again. Another morning, she spent nearly an hour helping the palace librarian repair damaged pages in an old history book instead of replacing it with a newer copy. When the librarian thanked her, she simply answered, "Some things deserve another chance because they still carry memories." Nathaniel felt those words settle heavily inside him. They sounded painfully familiar, yet they carried no accusation, no bitterness, only quiet conviction. Curious, he began asking discreet questions among the servants without revealing his growing suspicion. Every answer surprised him. One maid spoke about how Emily stayed after long workdays to help clean rooms belonging to workers who had fallen ill. A stable hand explained that she often visited frightened horses before sunrise because she believed calm voices eased anxious hearts. The palace seamstress smiled while describing how Emily secretly repaired worn uniforms so younger servants would not have to spend their limited wages on replacements. Not one person praised her beauty. Not one admired her because she sought attention. Every story centered on the same truth. She made other people's burdens lighter without expecting anything in return. Nathaniel slowly realized something that unsettled him far more than recognition ever could. 5 years earlier, he believed Evelyn Carter needed the palace in order to matter. Now he was witnessing a woman whose quiet kindness transformed every place she entered, proving that it had never been the palace giving her value. She had always been the one giving warmth to everyone around her. That evening, he walked alone through the western garden, where fading roses swayed beneath the cool breeze. Near the oldest stone fountain, he noticed Emily carefully placing a small wooden bowl of grain beneath an oak tree for birds preparing to migrate before winter. She remained there for a few peaceful moments, watching the tiny creatures gather without making a sound. Nathaniel stayed hidden behind the flowering hedges, unable to look away. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she reached into the pocket of her apron and tied a faded blue ribbon around the cracked handle of the wooden bowl so it would not split apart. The color caught the final rays of sunset, and Nathaniel's heart seemed to stop. He remembered that ribbon. He remembered placing it around a carved wooden wolf years ago with hands that believed promises would last forever. In that silent moment, doubt finally gave way to certainty, and the truth he had refused to accept for 5 long years stood only a few yards away, quietly feeding birds as though she had never once expected him to recognize her. King Nathaniel Ashford waited until the palace had settled into the quiet rhythm of early evening before asking the head steward to send the new maid to the Western Conservatory. He gave no explanation, only a simple request that she come after completing her duties. As the sun slipped below the distant hills, warm amber light filtered through the tall glass walls, painting long shadows across rows of blooming orchids and climbing ivy. Nathaniel stood alone beside the stone fountain at the center of the room, rehearsing countless questions that suddenly seemed impossible to ask. The wooden door opened with barely a sound. Emily Carter stepped inside and closed it gently behind her. She bowed with perfect respect. "Your Majesty, you wish to see me." Nathaniel studied her face in silence. 5 years had changed the softness of her features into quiet confidence, yet her eyes remained exactly as he remembered, calm enough to make every hurried thought slow down. "How long have you been working here?" he finally asked. 3 weeks, Your Majesty," she answered. "And before that?" She paused for only a moment. "I worked wherever honest hands were needed. Small villages, family farms, a school during one winter, a bakery one spring. I was fortunate to meet many kind people." Nathaniel noticed that every answer revealed something while carefully protecting everything that truly mattered. "Have we met before?" The question lingered between them. Emily looked toward the fountain, where gentle ripples reflected the fading light. When she spoke again, her voice remained peaceful. "Many people pass through a royal court, Your Majesty. It is understandable that some faces seem familiar." It was neither a lie nor a confession. Nathaniel felt the careful distance hidden inside every word. "I remember someone who believed broken things deserved another chance," he said quietly. "I remember someone who tied blue ribbons around small gifts because she thought kindness should be remembered. For the first time, Emily lifted her eyes fully to his. There was no fear inside them, no anger, only a quiet acceptance that surprised him more than either emotion could have. People change, she replied gently. Sometimes they must. Nathaniel took one slow step closer. Did you? A faint smile appeared upon her face, warm but restrained. No, Your Majesty. Life changed around me. I simply learned that peace does not always live where we expect to find it. The answer settled over the conservatory like the evening light itself. Nathaniel realized she had not returned seeking recognition. She had not left clues hoping he would discover her. She had accepted a simple position, completed every task with dignity, and expected nothing beyond honest work. The realization carried an unexpected weight. For 5 years he had imagined that if Evelyn ever returned, she would come with unanswered questions or old wounds waiting to be healed. Instead, she stood before him carrying neither accusation nor expectation. She had already found the peace he had assumed only the palace could provide. Before Nathaniel could gather the courage to ask the question that truly mattered, a bell echoed through the corridors announcing the evening meal for the palace staff. Emily offered another respectful bow. If there is nothing further, Your Majesty, the kitchen will need extra hands tonight. Nathaniel slowly nodded, unable to stop her without admitting everything he had finally begun to understand. She turned, opened the wooden door, and quietly disappeared into the corridor once more, leaving the Alpha King standing alone with the painful realization that the woman he had finally recognized no longer needed him to recognize her at all. After their conversation in the conservatory, King Nathaniel Ashford discovered that silence could be far heavier than any accusation. Emily Carter had offered him no anger to defend against and no blame to argue with. Instead, she had given him calm, and that quiet dignity forced him to examine memories he had avoided for 5 long years. The following morning, he entered the royal archives before sunrise, requesting every council record, household report, and servant registry from the season when Evelyn had disappeared. The elderly archivist looked surprised, but asked no questions. Dust drifted through narrow beams of morning light as thick ledgers covered the long oak table. Nathaniel turned each page slowly, reading not as a king searching for facts, but as a man searching for the truth he had never bothered to seek. Hidden among routine reports and forgotten correspondence, a painful pattern slowly emerged. There had been complaints questioning Evelyn's place within the court, whispered recommendations that she be reassigned to lesser duties, and subtle remarks suggesting she lacked the refinement expected inside the royal household. None of those documents carried open cruelty. They were polite, carefully written, and easy to overlook. Years earlier, Nathaniel had signed several of them without reading beyond the summaries prepared by his advisors. At the time, he believed he was simply managing a busy kingdom. Now he realized every careless signature had allowed someone else's judgment to shape another person's life. As the morning passed, Eleanor Whitmore quietly entered the archives carrying tea. She hesitated before speaking. There is something I never believed was my place to tell you, Your Majesty. Nathaniel looked up. Eleanor carefully placed a small wooden box upon the table. Inside rested the palace key Evelyn had left behind 5 years earlier, still wrapped beside a faded blue ribbon. The night she departed, Eleanor said softly, I asked why she was leaving without defending herself. She smiled and told me that people should never beg to remain where they are merely tolerated. She said that kindness offered only after someone has been broken is often too late. Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the ribbon. Every word settled deeply inside him because he knew she had never spoken them to make him feel guilty. She had spoken them because she truly believed them. Eleanor continued gently. She also asked me for one favor. If you ever wondered where she had gone, I was to tell you not to search for her. She hoped that one day you would understand the difference between protecting someone and simply assuming they would always stay. The room fell completely silent. Nathaniel remembered standing on the palace balcony years before, convinced that Evelyn would return because he believed loyalty could not exist without dependence. He finally understood how mistaken he had been. She had not left because she lacked courage. She had left because she possessed enough self-respect to walk away without demanding that anyone choose her. Later that afternoon, as Nathaniel crossed the central courtyard, He noticed Emily helping two young servants decorate the stone walkway with autumn flowers for the upcoming harvest celebration. She laughed quietly as one of the children accidentally placed every flower upside down before patiently showing him the proper way. She never noticed the king watching from across the courtyard. Nathaniel remained where he was, realizing that while he had spent 5 years believing he had lost someone important, the greater truth was far more painful. He had never truly seen her until she no longer needed to be seen by him. The annual harvest gathering filled Blackwood Palace with music, warm candlelight, and guests from every corner of the kingdom, yet King Nathaniel Ashford found no comfort in the celebration surrounding him. Standing before hundreds of nobles, merchants, village leaders, and palace staff, he understood that the change he needed to make could not remain a private realization hidden inside his own heart. It had to become something greater than regret. When the final performance ended, Nathaniel stepped onto the grand platform without the prepared speech his advisors had written for him. The unexpected silence spread quickly across the great hall. Every conversation faded as the king looked across the faces gathered before him. His voice was calm, but every word carried unusual honesty. A kingdom becomes stronger when every person is treated with dignity, not merely those born into privilege. The audience exchanged curious glances as Nathaniel continued. He announced new royal standards for every household serving the crown. Promotions would be based upon character and ability rather than family status alone. Every servant would receive proper education if they desired it. Elderly workers would no longer fear losing their homes after years of loyal service. Complaints involving disrespect toward palace staff would be investigated with the same seriousness given to disputes among nobles. The hall remained completely silent because no one had expected reforms that offered no advantage to the royal family itself. Nathaniel paused before speaking once more. Years ago, I believed loyalty would always remain where comfort existed. I now understand that respect must come before loyalty, and kindness must never depend upon someone's position. He never mentioned Evelyn Carter by name. He did not reveal her identity. He did not ask anyone to forgive him. His words were not an attempt to reclaim what had already been lost. They were simply the truth he had learned too late. Near the back of the great hall, Emily stood among the palace servants carrying a silver tray prepared for the evening meal. She listened quietly, her expression unchanged while whispers spread through the gathered crowd. Some nobles appeared uncertain. Others nodded with thoughtful approval. The younger servants exchanged hopeful smiles that grew brighter with every announcement. Eleanor Whitmore glanced toward Emily for only a brief moment before lowering her eyes again, understanding more than anyone else what those changes truly meant. When the gathering finally ended, guests slowly departed into the cool autumn night, discussing the king's surprising decisions. Nathaniel remained alone inside the empty hall until he heard soft footsteps behind him. Emily approached only because the remaining candles needed to be collected before morning. As she carefully lifted the nearest lantern, Nathaniel spoke without turning around. I cannot change yesterday. She stopped for a moment, but said nothing. But I can choose what kind of kingdom tomorrow becomes. The quiet lasted several heartbeats before Emily answered gently. Tomorrow belongs to everyone willing to build it, Your Majesty. There was no praise in her voice and no bitterness either. Only simple truth. She continued gathering the last candles exactly as she had gathered every other responsibility since returning to the palace. Nathaniel watched her disappear through the great wooden doors carrying nothing except a small basket of fading light, realizing that redemption was not earned through one speech or one decision. It would be measured by every choice that followed, and for the first time in many years, he was prepared to make those choices without expecting anything in return. Spring arrived at Blackwood Palace with gentle rain, bright blossoms, and the quiet feeling that even old stone walls could learn something new. Nearly a year had passed since King Nathaniel Ashford announced the reforms that had surprised the entire kingdom. At first, many believed they were only promises spoken during a celebration, but seasons proved otherwise. Young servants now attended evening lessons after completing their daily work. Elderly workers who had once feared becoming forgotten spent peaceful afternoons tending gardens instead of worrying about where they would sleep. Promotions were quietly earned through dedication rather than family names, and laughter had gradually replaced the uneasy silence that had once filled the servants' corridors. Nathaniel never claimed credit for the changes. Whenever advisors praised his wisdom, he simply reminded them that a strong kingdom could not stand if kindness belonged only to those with power. He no longer walked through the palace expecting people to lower their eyes in fear. Instead, he greeted gardeners, cooks, librarians, and stable hands with the same respect he offered visiting nobles. The transformation was slow, imperfect, and sometimes challenged by tradition, but it continued because he chose it every single day. Emily Carter remained exactly as she had always been. She still arrived before sunrise, still noticed the smallest acts of kindness, and still carried herself with the quiet dignity that had never depended upon titles or recognition. The younger servants admired her without knowing the full story, believing she had simply been born with uncommon patience. Only Eleanor Whitmore knew how much strength had been required to become so peaceful. One warm afternoon, the palace hosted a small spring gathering for workers and their families inside the Western Gardens. Children ran between blooming flowers while musicians played cheerful melodies beneath the ancient oak trees. Nathaniel stepped away from the guests for a moment and found Emily arranging fresh wildflowers inside simple glass vases for the dining tables. She noticed him approaching and offered the same respectful smile she had given him every day since returning. This time, however, neither of them hurried to speak. The silence felt comfortable instead of uncertain. After a long moment, Nathaniel looked across the colorful gardens where families laughed together beneath the bright blue sky. "The palace feels different now," he said quietly. Emily followed his gaze before answering. "People feel different. Buildings only reflect the hearts inside them." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I used to believe leadership meant being followed." He smiled with quiet humility. "Now I think it begins with learning to listen." Emily looked at him for a brief moment, and something gentle warmed her expression. That lesson changes more lives than most people realize. There were no dramatic declarations, no promises asking her to stay, and no requests for the past to return. Some things had been lost forever, and both of them understood that. Yet something new had quietly grown where regret once lived. It was built upon honesty, respect, and choices freely made instead of expectations quietly assumed. As the afternoon breeze carried flower petals across the garden paths, Nathaniel noticed a familiar faded blue ribbon tied carefully around the handle of a small wooden basket filled with fresh bread for the children. Emily caught him smiling at the simple detail and smiled back without saying a word. For the first time in many years, neither of them needed to explain anything. Sometimes the greatest change was not that someone returned after disappearing. It was that both people had become worthy of meeting again, not as the king and the omega they once were, but as two hearts that had finally learned the true meaning of dignity, compassion, and hope.